Good evening and welcome to a KLS book event looking at The People on the Beach by Rosie Whitehouse. This is a really excellent and thought-provoking book that tells stories that have got lost and been hidden and makes us think again about the Holocaust, not just as the events between 1933 and 1945, but the ongoing impact and how people moved on from them. And this book, which I hope you're getting how much I've enjoyed, written by Rosie Whitehouse, who she keeps saying to me that she's not an academic, but actually, although I think she blurs the line between academic and journalist, she has that incisive questioning that is clear. She works specialising on the Holocaust. She writes the BBC, for the Observer, for the Independent and the Tablet, the Jewish Chronicle, and other organisations and journals. She's also the historical advisor to the 45 age group, which represents the child Holocaust survivors. And she's here this evening to talk about her book, which is really exciting. How we're going to work this evening is I'm going to ask Rosie some questions, but I hope that people will contribute questions via the chat, whatever media you're on. And they will get put into the chat on Zoom, and so we will be able to pick them up from there. But I think I'd like to start by just asking Rosie, what drew you to this particular story, these particular people on this beach?
Well, firstly, hello everybody, and it's a delight to be here. I do specialise in stories about the Holocaust, and I write a lot about it, but I'm also a travel writer, and I'm the author of a Bract guide to the province of Italy called Liguria, which is better known as the Italian Riviera. So the Italian Riviera is my patch, which is a rather nice patch to have, I must say. And when I was researching the guidebook, Bract leave you free to cover what interests you about the region that you're writing about. And I'm very interested in Italy immediately after the war. So I began clicking on the names of towns, putting in 1945 and 1946 after them. Savona is a port between Genoa and the French border. And I put in Savona and I clicked 1945 and then I clicked 1946. And up came a newspaper cutting which described how over 1,000 Jews had arrived in the middle of the night in June 1946 to catch a boat which had sailed from New York. And they then attempted to run the Royal Naval blockade of Palestine. Well, I was completely bowled over. I thought this was an incredible story. So I said to my husband, have you ever heard of this? His family had been involved in shipping in Italy for decades, and he just looked at me quite blank. We then began to ask friends of ours in Liguria what they knew about this, and nobody knew anything. So we went down to the beach, which is a tiny port next to Savona called Vardo, and we started asking people who were on the beach if they ever knew anything about the story. And we came across a fisherman who remembered the boat setting sail, and I was fascinated by what he had to say. And I imagined that when I got back to the flat, that I would go on Amazon and with one click I would buy a book which would tell me exactly who these people were and how they made their way to the beach, let alone how this boat sailed from New York and they knew where to go to catch it. It was just such an extraordinary story. And I found no such book. I had to buy hundreds and hundreds of books, and I had to travel hundreds, if not thousands of miles in order to find the answer to the story. And I've now had to write that book, which you can all buy with one click on Amazon.
Sorry, I'm going to backtrack a tiny bit and ask you, because you said about how you came to be involved with this bit of Italy, but I was also, when we were talking before, very fascinated by your story about how you became involved and interested in the Holocaust, and that based in your own family history. Would you mind just sharing that as well?
Yes, well, there are two aspects here. One is that you may tell from my surname, which is what survivors always ask me, why are you interested in the story Whitehouse? I don't think that's a Jewish name. And correct, it's not a Jewish name. But I grew up in a household where people were always talking about the First and the Second World War. And people were also always talking about the Holocaust. I grew up in Richmond and Kingston, so I'm a local girl in that sense. And my father was a doctor at Westminster and at Roehampton Hospital. And his two best friends at the hospital were Poles. One was a Jewish doctor and one was a non-Jewish doctor. They both survived the Katyn Forest massacre, and their two wives were survivors of Auschwitz. The non-Jewish lady was a patient of my father's because she had been a victim of Dr. Mengele. And she was just one of the many people who'd been experimented on by Dr. Mengele that my father helped, because these people were left in tremendous pain by these medical experiments which were carried out on them. So my interest in the Holocaust began by knowing that my father's hand was actually going where this extraordinary bad doctor's hand had previously gone. And as a small child, I was intrigued by what kind of circumstances would allow a bad doctor to be able to operate on people. And my parents' friends never stopped talking about their experiences. They had a lot of time for me. They were like my uncles and aunts. And that's because they had no children. They were left, the non-Jewish couple were left unable to have children because of the work of Dr. Mengele, and the Jewish couple, the lady had lost her children from her first marriage in Auschwitz. And so I grew up surrounded by these people, and then as a teenager I began to travel to Eastern Europe with my father, who went there on cultural exchange trips. And I remember very clearly at one point we were taken on a walk through the previously Jewish area of Krakow. And I remember that the lady who took us there whispering under her breath, saying, "Oh, the Jews used to live here. Don't mention that to anybody. We're just passing through." And to me, this was an incredible contrast between the house that I grew up in Ham, near Kingston, to this total silence of Eastern Europe, where the Holocaust was literally not to be talked about. And it developed in me an incredible fascination with Eastern Europe, which I then pursued at university. And then I met my husband, who is Jewish and does have a Holocaust story in his family. But more importantly, we then have lived and worked in Eastern Europe for much of our adult lives. And my husband is a foreign correspondent, and he's covered more wars and genocides than I like to remember. And it's left me with a fascination with conflict and also with conflict resolution, which is obviously something that didn't happen in the case of the Holocaust.
Yes. So you got that background and the fascination both in Italy, but so how did you didn't find the one-click answer to this story. So how did you research this book and make the contacts in order to be able to tell this story?
Well, the first thing I realized was that, and it was always the people on the beach, and I realized that I wanted, well, first to write a story about it, and then I realized that I wanted to write about a book. It was always about the people. And I think it's quite interesting, without realizing that I didn't call it the Jews on the beach, I called it the people on the beach. And I really felt that I was looking for ordinary people. I discovered extraordinary people, but I knew that they were just ordinary people like anybody you might meet, who happened to end up on this beach in Italian Riviera. And so the key way to start was to find out their names, because if I wanted to discover their stories, I had to find out who they were. Now, I first rather foolishly started searching for a passenger list, thinking that such a thing must exist. But my elder daughter, who's at this point working for UNHCR, goes, "For goodness sake, Mommy, this is a refugee boat. There's no list of who's on this." But fortunately for me, unfortunately for the people on the beach, when they did smash through the Royal Naval blockade, that they were then interned in the Atlit detention centre near Haifa, and there they recorded their names. And I got their names, their date of birth, year of birth, nothing more complicated than that, and the country of origin. And that began to set me off on an ability to discover some of these stories. I was then found a copy of a Hebrew newspaper in which their arrival in Palestine Mandate was recorded. And this most crucially gave the names of their parents, because many of these people later went on to change their names. And so it was only by tracing what had happened to their parents that I could then find them later when they gave a testimony or appeared in other records of the immediate post-Holocaust period.
I mean, I think we talked quite a lot around the book. Do you want to tell us sort of one of the key stories of the book? I mean, there are so many stories in it, but just to pick one, to just talk us through, to give a flavour of what this book is about and the kind of stories that are in it.
Well, the first thing that I wanted to find out is when and how did the people decide that there was no future for them in Eastern Europe? And that's the first thing to say, that besides one or two people who sailed on the boat, which is called the Josiah Wedgwood, they were from Eastern Europe. And I wanted to know why, when these people had lived for generation upon generation in these lands, that after the liberation, they decided that there was no future for them. I started with the normal assumption of thinking, well, this obviously had to be because there was a bloodbath. And so I went to a town called Rivne in Ukraine, which was, before the Second World War, Rovna in Poland. And it was the first town in the pre-war Poland, which was liberated by the Red Army. At this point, the Kremlin hadn't made up their minds where the borders were going to be, and they said anybody who was a citizen of pre-war Poland could do what they wanted. They could leave if they wanted, or they could stay. And at first I discovered that the Jews who were liberated in Rivne and the surrounding area believed that they could start their lives anew in Rivne. Now, for those of you who don't know very much about Rivne, Rivne was the site of one of the most appalling atrocities. Its anniversary was a few days ago, and almost 23,000 people were murdered by the Nazis and shot in death pits. It's known as the Second Baba Yar. So you would assume that that's enough to make you think that there's no future for you. But in fact, I discovered that most of those Jews thought that they would be safe in Rivne. Rivne had been a predominantly Polish and Jewish town before the outbreak of the conflict. And people believed that it would continue to be so, even if there were less Jews. But what we see was playing into this field is the fact that the nature of what's on the ground at that time had changed substantially because of the Second World War, because of the invasion, the Nazi invasion, because of the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland, and that it had not ignited because it existed before the Second World War, but had literally put a touch paper to Ukrainian nationalism. And the Ukrainians began to want to ethnically cleanse the countryside, and then they began to want to ethnically cleanse Rivne, which is a process which is actually still going on today, as the Polish and the Jewish buildings are being knocked down and replaced by modern Ukrainian ones. So I started my story catching a train in the middle of winter to Rivne and going about and speaking to people there, speaking very importantly to the rabbi there and asking him, what was it like to be a rabbi in Rivne? And he was the descendant of one of the partisans, well, he is the descendant of one of the partisans who liberated Rivne. And these were the people who eventually came to the conclusion that there was no future for their people in Rivne, and they decided to lead them out. Now, this sounds a very simple proposition, but they make this decision in the late summer, early autumn of 1944. The Hungarian Jews are just arriving at Auschwitz. And this is an incredible dangerous moment for Jews to move westward. But they decide that's what they're going to do, and the partisans decide that they're going to try to get their people to the Mediterranean coast and onward to Palestine.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to throw it open. I can see that we've got a couple of questions already. Is certainly, I had, you say you talked to people and nobody had heard this story. I'd heard, as a teenager, along with everybody else, I'd read Leon Uris's The Exodus, but this story got lost. It vanished almost into thin air until you started digging. And why do you think this story, or rather these stories, because it's not just one story, it's a range of interlinked stories, got lost, hidden?
Well, I think it's really important there that you mentioned Leon Uris and the book Exodus, because I remember reading this as a teenager. I don't actually remember seeing the film. I watched the film again when I was writing the book. But this is really important because that's one of the few things that we know about the exodus of the Jews from Europe, and it's a piece of fiction. And this is a problem with a lot of what we know about the Holocaust. There's nothing wrong with reading pieces of fiction which are set in the Holocaust, and there's nothing wrong with watching films like Schindler's List. We just have to always remember that this is fiction. It's not actually journalistic fact. And I say this because I am a journalist, and I was very keen to establish the facts of why people left from Eastern Europe. And those facts that appear in the book are actually quite nuanced. But it is important to ask this question about why we've forgotten about it. There's the first the answers I alluded to in the answer to your first question, that Eastern Europe went into a communist deep freeze. And in that communist deep freeze, there were no different ethnic groups who suffered under the Nazis. There were just the people of the Soviet Union or the communist countries of Eastern Europe. So the Jews had no single treatment. And it's very easy for us to go, oh, how bad they were. But also we have to remember that the Holocaust went into a Cold War paradigm in Western Europe too. So that people did not want to talk about the Holocaust in too much detail because they wanted now people to understand that the Nazis were a tyranny who oppressed people, and now there was another tyranny who was the enemy, and that was called the Soviet Union. So actually talking in those immediate 1950s about what had been happening in Eastern Europe was to the Jews was not at the forefront. And then I think because we are sitting here in Britain, we have to address the fact that it's a very uncomfortable question for Britain. And we don't like looking at difficult parts of our British Empire past. Black Lives Matter has shown that to us. But there's also a Jewish element to this story because it's about British policy towards the Jews during the Palestine Mandate period, which was not particularly friendly. I did say that the Josiah Wedgwood and the people on the beach tried to run the Royal Naval blockade of Palestine. Now, these people on this boat were desperate refugees, I think, fleeing a really toxic continent. And British Marines were forced to board these boats. It was a very difficult position for the Royal Navy. And they actually fought these people, who fought back with cans and potatoes and all sorts of things. But the British then rounded them up and put them in a detention camp. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Atlit, but it's really shocking when the train pulls up outside the town, and you can actually still see the watchtower, the wooden watchtower. How that must have felt to suddenly be placed there after your experiences of being in the ghettos and the camps is just beyond comprehension.
Andre, can I ask you to unmute yourself and turn your camera on, and we'll go to your question, please. Hoping Andre is going to appear.
Yes, I am. I'm just trying to remember what my question is and get rid of the food around my mouth because I'm in the middle of eating. That's all right. Let me just have a quick look at my question. What did I put? Yeah, how did you decide whose stories to cover in the book? And were there any individual stories that you considered just focusing on them as a way to tell the story for everyone?
Thank you, Andre.
Well, firstly, the stories began to reveal themselves to me through the demographics of the book, of the people on the beach, that they were mostly people in their late teens, 20s and early 30s. There were very, very few people over the age of 40, and there was absolutely nobody under the age of 13. So firstly, that teaches us a lot about what happened in the Holocaust in itself, is that many of these people had been partisans in the forest or had survived slave labor. So if you weren't useful for slave labor, you didn't tend to survive the Holocaust. But it also begged the question is that these people didn't just buy a ticket to go on the Josiah Wedgwood. They were selected to go on the Josiah Wedgwood. So who was selecting them and why were they being selected? And then I began to realize that there was a very high number of fascinating partisans who sailed on the boat, both men and women. And that begged a question was, firstly, is that because the partisans were naturally more pushy and pushed themselves forward in the queue? Or were the Jews who had come from the Palestine Mandate, who were operating the underground movement in Italy, particularly selecting people, Jews with guns, to take to the Palestine Mandate? There were also a large number of young teenagers who were on this boat, over 100 of them who formed this extraordinary friendship group and had stuck together for an entire year in Italy before they sailed. So there were very many interesting questions that came out of it. I'm always asked which was the most interesting story, and I would say I haven't found it yet, because I did not find the names of all these people. And if you get a copy of the book, you'll see that at the back of the book, there's a list of the names of the passengers. Some people I have information about, but the vast majority of them, I just know their name, their date of birth, and their country of origin. And interestingly, most of those came from Romania. So Romania remains, in my book, the untold story. And it is a forgotten aspect of the Holocaust. What happened in Transnistria during the Second World War is not really known. And I was very sad about this, particularly because I lived in Romania immediately after the revolution. I've always had a soft spot for Romania. So I was very frustrated by this. And one of the reasons that this happened was because, for some reason I don't know the answer to, when the Romanians arrived at Atlit, their names were suddenly written down in a Slavic fashion. So Abramovici became Abramovich. And I don't know who did that and why, but I'm still hoping that those people will come forward and they will reveal yet more fascinating tales that I can tell.
Tina, can I get you to ask your question, please?
Hi, Rosie. Yeah, there's just, apart from a lot of the fascinating stories, because I'm sort of, this is so fresh in my mind, there's a passage that absolutely fascinated me on page 124, 125, about where you talk about Jews becoming a united race, if you like. And I was wondering, I was going to ask you personally, do you consider Jews to have just be part of a religion, part of a race, or both?
Well, I think probably both. And I think that that's what there's a cultural heritage, which obviously, as we know, transcends boundaries, it transcends borders, it transcends language. And as I do tell the story of Moshe HaElion, who was from Thessalonica, who spoke Ladino, but, he would definitely, he recognized the same cultural backgrounds, which overarching. So I think that if you tend to approach it from that way, you'll see what's beginning to bring the people together. I think that you're making a reference here particularly to what happened in the displaced persons camps in the American zone, which I wrote about at some length in the book, because initially, and I don't think we should criticize the Americans too much for this, because the extent of how many Jews would have survived the Holocaust and how many of them would have been in camps in Nazi Germany, people actually didn't expect very many. They thought about 5,000 Jews survived the Holocaust. And they did not realize that so many Jews had been taken on death marches, and they really had no comprehension of this. There was no reason that they should have had a comprehension of this, because the real problem in the Second World War was that there were no reporters on the ground. If there'd been reporters walking alongside the death march, the Allies would have known better how to respond to the issue on the ground, but there weren't. And so originally they decided that the best policy was to return people to their homes. And that's actually what the vast majority of Jews wanted to do, unless they had realized already that their homes were completely destroyed, which is the case particularly of the Jews from Kovna. Yeah. But they were then classified by nationality. So if you were a Jew from Ukraine, you could end up with Ukrainian guards who had been persecuting you in the camps. Now, to us today, this seems totally unacceptable, but I mean, we just have to rewind a little bit. And this is war zones are very confusing places, and this was a war zone to end all war zones. So, but into this steps this phenomenal US Army chaplain, Rabbi Abraham Klausner, who comes out to speak for the people and to give them a voice. And when they begin to find their voice, they do find it not just through culture, and the cultural explosion within the DP camps was an extraordinary one, with Yiddish newspapers and theatre and school, but there was also a huge burst of Zionism. So people who were all, before the war 50-50, they suddenly became much more committed to the Zionist cause. And of course, this was fed by the harsh attitudes of those allies who kept the doors closed to the Jewish survivors, including the British, who kept the doors of Palestine closed, because although the Labour Party promised that they would reform the White Paper of 1939, which had severely limited immigration to Palestine, they did not do that when they took office. And this literally fed again into this belief that the only place was Palestine where the survivors could find safety.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yes, thanks very much. It's just very to know how long they were imprisoned. You said they were interned by the British and then in Palestine, and also whether any of them are still alive. From your earlier answer, you said that there are quite a few of them were teenagers, so I imagine there would be some in their early 90s now.
Yes, they weren't. I mean, it was a dramatic experience to end up in the Atlit detention centre, but most of them stayed in Atlit for less than 6 weeks. Interestingly enough, it's the partisans who get themselves released first, largely because I think they were just pushier and they knew how to operate the system. But it was also at a very dramatic moment that they ended up in Atlit, because this was the moment that the British were really cracking down on the Jewish underground. And just before the Wedgwood arrived in Haifa, they had gone around and they had arrested thousands and thousands of members of the Jewish underground who also found their way in Atlit. So Atlit was a tinderbox at this point. And then going to your question about, did I find any of them alive? Well, yes, I did, but that just sounds quite a simple solution to that problem. It literally took me months of searching for some people to actually find them. I don't speak Hebrew, and I resorted in the end to searching for people in Hebrew, and then clicking Google Translate to try to work out what was being said about people in the newspaper. And as anybody ever tried to Google Translate Hebrew, it's pretty dodgy what you get afterwards. And actually, we're referring back now to Rivne, and there was one gentleman who sailed on the boat who came from Rivne, and I was really desperate to find him. He was one of, if not the youngest person to sail on the Wedgwood. And eventually I found him by doing exactly this. And I found a newspaper cutting of him in a newspaper in Haifa. And he was with a granddaughter who was in military uniform, seemed to be winning some kind of award. And I thought, how am I going to find this man? This is still solution is not solved. So I thought she must be on Facebook. She looked about 22. So I went on Facebook and I looked at all the people who had a similar name to her, and I just kept cross-referencing the pictures till I decided that was her, and I sent her a message. And then she said, yes, that is my grandfather, and I'll put you in contact with my uncle, who can put you in contact with him. And then eventually I arrived he lives in Haifa, this gentleman now, and I arrived and we had coffee and Polish cakes in his sitting room in Haifa. And what was very interesting about that story was that his son came to translate, because Yitzhak Kaplan doesn't speak English, and as I said, I don't speak Hebrew, and I don't speak Polish, and I don't speak Yiddish. But so he did the translation. But what he found fascinating was it was the first time that he had heard his father talk about this, and talk about how they left Rivne, and his sister was married to a partisan. So for me, meeting him was actually like it was touching history, and also it was intensely moving because one of his sisters was murdered in the Sosenki Forest massacre, as were her 2 children. So yes, I did find them, and I found that was most fascinating, and it was really important for me to meet them in their homes, where they were just being ordinary people like you and me. It's like, I mean, obviously I'm not in your home now, but I'm in mine and you're in yours, so it's as close as we can get. But it brought about an intimate relationship, which I hope to bring across in the book, of the Holocaust not being history, and as being a living history in which people are reacting to continually. I mean, most of the time you don't think about it, but it can suddenly pop out and go boo at you, and you're least thinking about it, and there's something to remind you about it. And I think that people who don't have that in their background don't really understand that. So I wanted that to come across in the book, because I always hoped that the book would not just end up on some kind of ghetto shelf. I wanted people who were not Jewish to read this book, and to begin to understand what had happened.
Okay.
I think, Linda, that Rosie's picked up quite a lot of your question, but do you want to come in and ask about the people, the numbers and things?
Yes, sure. Hi, Rosie.
Hi.
Can you just remind us how many people were on the beach, just to give us an idea of scale and what proportion you managed to trace? The other part of my question was about children and grandchildren, and did the majority not talk about their story, as so typically happen with Holocaust survivors?
Well, there were 1,300 people who sailed on the Wedgwood. And at first, when I tracked down the names at Lit and then in the newspaper published in Tel Aviv, I just assumed that there were no children that sailed on this boat. But I then read an account written by one of the American volunteers who sailed on the boat, never having been to sea before. Most of the American crew, had never been to sea before. And they were in a Canadian corvette. I have a model of it here. And Canadian corvettes were famous for their rolling action. So this was not a nice boat to be on at all if you've never been to sea. And in his account, he described nursing mothers. He described children running around the deck. And then he described how he met a couple who had both lost their families during the Holocaust, who had remarried and had a child. And I could not believe that these children were not recorded. Their names were nowhere to be found. And I could not find their names in the course of researching this book. So again, these people should be very much alive, and I'm hoping that they will come forward and we can begin to piece together their stories. And as you were saying about, remind me what you just asked me about second and third generation.
So quite commonly, Holocaust survivors didn't really talk about their experience until someone like you would come along and actually prompt that, and then their own families learned the story. I wondered if that was common in your experience as well, or just that one person you'd already spoken about.
It was common. I mean, one of the things that my mother-in-law survived the Holocaust in France, and she never spoke about it. So I was aware that if you wanted to ask her something, you had to know specifically what you wanted to ask, and then you might get an answer. With that at the back of my mind, I decided that I would do all the traveling which is involved in the book, because I drove the route that the people came out, and I spoke to people along that route who were commemorating it, and I visited all the places that they came from. And the very last thing I did was to go to Israel and to interview the survivors. There was one survivor that I interviewed at great length by email, because he was living in Oregon and he was deaf. And so that was a complicated interview system. But I did not approach these people until I was completely sure what the story was, so that I would know specifically what to ask. Because if you don't know and you're trying to tell some complicated story, it's like anything in life. If somebody starts asking you a question about something they don't understand, you'll tend to fluff it off and go, oh, that's I'm not answering that, or poof, like my mother-in-law used to say. And so when I arrived in these people's houses, I knew a huge amount about their lives already, and I knew about where they had come from and many of their experiences. So I was able to ask very specific questions, and had very specific questions about what had happened to them in this period after the war, which they had not spoken about. And I work as Sara said, for the 45 Society, so I'm always interviewing Holocaust survivors, and more than one of them has said to me, who is this? Are you the police? Because I come in with very specific questions. But I think that you have to do that in order to unearth the story that they have been reluctant to tell. But also, many of these things didn't seem to be particularly dramatic. If your parents survived the Holocaust, you want to know firstly who your family were who died in it, and the drama of what happened to them. You don't actually ask too much about afterwards, because it's not the sexy bit in that sense. So when I went to interview one of the gentlemen who sailed on the Wedgwood, I was with his grandson, and the grandson was translating for me. The gentleman also spoke some Italian. I speak some Italian. So when his story actually arrived in Italy, and I started mentioning names of places, he literally started getting up from the table and going, amore, civilizzazione, and we started talking in Italian. And his grandson said to me, I don't know what you're asking my grandfather, but you're certainly hitting the spot. And in fact, I was talking to him about some very small things, like the first night he arrived in Italy. He'd never mentioned this to anybody. It's just like, well, in many ways, why would you? There were so many other things to explain to your family and your children, and you had to get on with your life as well. You didn't have all day to sit around chit-chatting about the past.
You might have reminded him of things that he'd forgotten, and you just reprompted memories.
I think it was a bit of a shock, and I think in that sense, as a journalist, you always have to be aware that you are intruding on people's lives when you ask them to tell you your story, and and that you have to do that with consideration and tenderness. And we were getting on very well, and he was very enthusiastic about the conversation that we were having. And I said, actually, I have some pictures on my computer I would like to show you. And then I opened my computer, and he just went, what are you doing with all my friends' pictures on your computer? And that actually hadn't entered my head that I was going to give him a shock like that. But he actually then found it very funny. And then he told me a story about these photographs, which were taken in Italy. And they were then sent through the official British mail postbag to his uncle who lived in Tel Aviv. And of course, they were pictures of them all as part of the Jewish underground, which was tickled in pink.
I think that actually leads really nicely on to Sandra and Howard. I don't know whether it's Sandra or Howard's question, but would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, it's mine actually. So yeah, it does. I was fascinated by what you were saying. So right at the beginning, Rosie, you mentioned a fisherman who you'd met in Italy, and that set me thinking about, did you find out anything about what role the local Italians played in this escape? Because these people must have travelled to get from Ukraine to Liguria. They must have travelled through a chunk of Italy. And I was thinking also of Philip Sands's book, The Rat Line, which exposed how some northern Italians, in particular Catholic priests, were very active in helping Nazi war criminals escape over the Alps and out through that very Liguria coast, through the port at Genova to South America. So what was going on in Italy with these escapees?
Well, firstly, you're completely right, Sandra, that there was this rat line that went down, particularly to Liguria. And so if you were a Holocaust survivor and you ended up in Liguria, you could actually find yourself sitting at a cafe, and the man at the table next to you could be a Nazi escaping. So Liguria is actually an incredibly interesting place in this post-war period. But yes, I did discover the story, firstly, of how the Italian Jewish community helped the survivors. And I think because we're in a British context here, I think it's interesting to make the two comparisons between what happened with the Central British Fund, who organised kinder transport and then brought the child Holocaust survivors to the UK after the war. We see a very similar set up in Italy. So before the Second World War, there was an official state-sanctioned refugee committee, and because Mussolini was happy to receive refugees initially from Germany and from Austria, and the Jewish community, much as the Central British Fund did here in Italy, cared for those refugees and helped them either to settle in Italy or to move on to somewhere else. obviously after the racial laws, that community had to go underground, and you then see them firstly trying to save themselves because people lost the right to work. So many people could no longer work as a doctor or a teacher, and the Jewish community in Italy were in great difficulty. And then after the Nazi invasion, the most important thing for the Italian Jewish community was to hide the children, and which they did. And then the leader of the Italian Jewish community was Raphael Cantoni. He's the Italian version of Leonard Montefiore in that sense. And he actually jumped from a train that was on the way to Auschwitz and spent the rest of the war in Lugano, which is obviously the Italian part of Switzerland. And after the war, he returned immediately to Milan. His assistant had been the lady who had hidden these children. And the main thing was to get those children back and to bring them up in a Jewish environment. So that was Cantoni's first decision. The moment he has done this, he suddenly finds literally Jewish survivors are literally walking over the Alps to come to Italy. The Italian Jewish community has to set up reception centres, and over 70,000 Holocaust survivors passed through Italy after the war, and they were cared for primarily by the Italian Jewish community, with the support of Jews who came from Palestine, who worked in the Jewish underground, and with support initially from the Jewish Brigade, which was a section of the British Army recruited in the Palestine Mandate, which had fought their way up Italy. So firstly, that is the historical story of what had happened. But as I said, my book is not just a history book. It's a book about contemporary things. It's a book about what the Holocaust means to people now, why this story is being remembered. In Italy, I met a lot of fascinating people who have been campaigning to have these stories remembered, because after the war, it wasn't just the Jewish community, but it was also those people on the left who supported and helped the Jews who arrived all over Italy, not just in Liguria, also particularly in Puglia in the south. And one of the reasons that the ship sailed from Vado near Savona is that Savona was a communist stronghold. And it was safe for the ship to sail from there, whereas the British were crawling all over Genoa. It was not safe to try to sail a ship from there. But of course, as time passed, the left began to change their mind about Israel, and took up the Palestinian cause and became very anti-Israel. But now it's important to talk about refugees in Italy, because it is the right who are opposed to refugees arriving in Italy. As we know, it's the reverse story, where the refugees are sailing in, trying to smash through the blockades which try to stop them landing on the West European coast. And these groups have tried to campaign by telling this story to convince Italians that they should open their arms and welcome refugees, which I think is a very important part of the story, and a contemporary aspect to it.
Thank you. Jackie, do you want to ask your question? You're still on mute, Jackie.
Okay, hi. Repeatedly, the people that you talk about who were survivors from the camps, you talk about the desperate situation they were in and how there was nothing organised really to feed them, clothe them, look after them. And I'm just amazed that anyone survived to then hike through or get transport to get to this beach. Was it all just hand to mouth? How did people survive?
Well, firstly, I think that largely, I mean, I started off talking about fictionalized accounts of the Holocaust, and in those fictionalized accounts, we tend to see the Holocaust survivor portrayed either as a weak, emaciated person unable to feed and help themselves, still in their prison garb, or we see them as somebody who's lost all ability to function in a normal society because of the trauma that they've endured. Well, the people I met were not like that. The people I met were people of incredible agency. And if that was contributed to their survival, that's also possibly a question. But the people were literally quite capable, just as I described the Italian Jewish community. The Jews of Rivne were quite capable of standing up, dusting themselves down and saying, right, okay, we've got to get on with it now. And how are we going to do that? And you see that in the leadership that the partisans took first of the people, bringing them out and beginning to center them in towns like Lublin, in Łódź, which became a very important centre for refugees and known in Yiddish as Lodz. And these places were actually helped by the American Joint. Money was funneled into Eastern Europe to help these survivors, and refugee centres were set up for them. And it's very important that when you think about what's happening with this money is also that I mentioned previously the Jewish Brigade who fought up Italy. The Jewish Brigade, obviously they were part of the British Army, they were given cigarette and alcohol rations. Well, they didn't use them. They sold them on the black market, and they kept that money in order to use to buy things which helped to help the refugees. They were positioned in the northeastern corner of Italy by the British, who thought that they were going to tuck them away out of harm's way because they were a little bit of a volatile unit, as you can imagine. And what the unit did was that they took British Army rations, they took British Army blankets, they took British Army petrol, and they went AWOL and they drove as far north as Łódź, where they began to round up the children and collect them in. So firstly, you see help from the JDC, you see the Jewish Brigade on the ground, and then you begin to see Jewish agents who had come from Palestine Mandate, who were also bringing money and goods. And how the exit system, the Brigade, worked was that you were given money along the way, and when you crossed from one country to another, you left that money, and then somebody gave you more money when you crossed into the next one. And this was a set of agents who included partisans, former partisans, agents from the Yishuv, and survivors themselves who were operating this exit route. It's the survivors who operate this. The people who sailed on the boat were also very important actors in what was the illegal immigration from Italy, Aliyah Bet. They were key players in this. Many of them had been working in Italy, helping survivors since they themselves arrived. So yes, these are people of agency.
I think we can take as a final sort of question, which I may then follow up. Shamara, do you want to ask your own question, or would you like it to be asked for you?
Oh, yeah, I can ask. First of
Please.
all, thanks a lot for such an academic and informative talk. I'm really amazed to hear all these facts and figures. But I have a very simple question. That what, in your opinion, what do you think that how can we achieve peace and prosperity all around, not only in our society, but on a wider scale as well, through such fantastic work of literature and academic talks? If you could shed some light on that. Thank you.
That I know is a big challenge. As I said at the beginning, my husband is a war correspondent and has covered countless wars and conflicts. Yes, I would very much like to know that answer to my question myself. But I think there are a number of, I think one of the fundamental things about resolving conflict is when conflict has publicity. And my husband covered the entirety of the Balkan Wars, and the publicity that was generated by newspaper articles and by footage and photographs from that conflict actually drove the international community to take action. And part of that action included the Dayton Peace Accords. And this has been a really important way of re-establishing normalcy in the Balkans. And I think that the more you can talk about this in the press, about conflicts that happen today, the more important it is. And I think that that's where my book is also important, because there are many myths that have grown up around the founding of the State of Israel. Among the most notorious are, that the Jews who left from Europe were colonialist settlers who sailed there on British ocean liners. Well, this is simply not true. And if we are ever going to resolve the conflicts in the Middle East, we need to make sure that everybody understands the facts. And I hope that my book will contribute some way to that by establishing the fact of what happened to those people and why they decided they had no future in Europe. And I hope also that it'll bring an understanding that if you give a refugee a hand, this is what can happen to them. They can go on to be very successful people. The people on the beach went on to build the state of Israel. They were very dynamic people, and those refugees who came to the UK as the boys also made an enormous contribution to society here.
I think sort of brings me almost to my final thing is, what would you like to be the message that people take on from this book? Where do you want this story to go next, and how can it influence where we go next?
Well, I'm not a big fan of lessons from the Holocaust. I do think you can get lessons from history, and I think that those are important to recognise. I could see some of the things that I recognised from history books and from my own experience working as a reporter in Northern Ireland on the ground in the former Yugoslavia before the war broke out. So I think it's about recognising the warning signs. These are not necessarily lessons. We know what the warning signs are, and they're the 10 steps to genocide. I work a lot in Holocaust education, and when I introduce this in the classroom, the very first thing I start to say to the children is, what are these 10 steps to genocide? And unfortunately, they all recognise step 1 and 2. It's like, oh, you're not like us. You know, and this is I think what we need to learn, and you know, I also think that we have to think about why we remember things and why we choose to forget things, and I'm increasingly interested in the role of memory in history, and that can be both a positive one and a toxic one, as we can see in contemporary Ukraine. I write about that in the book in Rivne.
I think we will begin to draw ourselves to close. I think thank you so much for sharing with us not only your thoughts this evening, but a fascinating story of something that has got forgotten, this journey from Europe to Israel and the integral part within the founding of the State of Israel. I think that is absolutely fascinating. And so thank you very much for sharing that with us and for answering our questions. And if anybody's not read the book, may I really recommend that you do. I think it is fascinating and a really interesting read. I will just do a very quick plug that our KLS book group, Book Crashers, will be discussing the book again on Saturday, which will give us a chance to have more of a backwards and forwards, though we won't have the pleasure of Rosie's company to do so. I'm going to very quickly just ask everybody just to unmute themselves so we can give Rosie a round of applause, even if we can't actually do it in person. Thank you, Rosie, so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I must say it's been a pleasure that I was able to actually meet you all and you were able to come up and ask questions, because I've been in some webinars where I haven't been able to see anybody, and I like going out and talking to people. So I've really enjoyed this session. I
don't know whether you can see, Rosie, the chat box is filling with thank yous. From both from here and from Facebook as well. And so thank you so much, and we wish you every luck with the book, and we hope that you continue to get success with it. And
if she actually had the scan.
And can I just say to people, I think it's a really good way of us having marked the anniversary of Crystal Knapp, and so thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Sarah.
Thank you, Rosie. I hope that was what you wanted from that.
Yeah, it was great. No, I hope everybody was happy.
Yeah. Okay. here. I think we're off.